Yes. Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and get going. I've waited a couple minutes to hopefully let everybody in the, we got one more. This might be Carol.
Okay.
Okay.
Right, well, we're getting started more promptly than last week.
We were
Think
fine
you
with
could
that.
fit more in?
Yeah, that's what, I don't recall.
Oh, come on now.
We said.
There we go.
Oh, I didn't come last.
Okay, so we started last week, the battle for the Nicene Creed. And we're going to finish that up tonight. And we're also going to get through paganism's counteroffensive. So we'll get all caught up and then we'll finish up next week with kind of the end of paganism and the new conflict between the church and the emperors. And, you know, as we've already seen, Constantine has found himself having to get involved in the church. And as we're going to see tonight, Constantine's sons likewise get involved in the church. And eventually, what we'll find next week in a fascinating story is that the church pushes back against that. So, by way of review, remember that our class really started with the Great Persecution, right? That was Rome's most systematic attempt to eradicate Christianity. And we had some people who were martyred as a result of that, and other people who, caved in. And they called the people who caved in the traditores because they had handed over the scripture, and the Latin word for hand over is traditore. And we then talked about the conversion of Constantine, how he had started to embrace Christianity and throughout his life gradually revealed more and more that he was a Christian, possibly was actually in the process of converting. We'll never know. And then we talked about Constantine and the church. Remember, out of the Great Persecution, we had the church itself kind of split over this question of how do we deal with the traditores? And you had the hardliners, the Meletians in Alexandria, who played a role in the dispute with Athanasius, and in North Africa, the Donatists. So last week we talked about Arianism, okay? And in a nutshell, Arius's belief or his doctrine was that Christ was not co-eternal with God the Father and not of the same essence as God the Father, right? And this was counter to traditional Christian orthodoxy. It was appealing, though, particularly in the Greek East, the Greek-speaking East, because it was a logical way of explaining the Trinity. Whereas if you've ever tried to comprehend the idea of the Trinity, one God and three gods, you know, it can't be comprehended by the human mind. And the Greek mind doesn't like that kind of messiness, right? They want a philosophical order. So Arianism appealed to a lot of Greek thinkers for that reason. In any event, Constantine, in order to resolve this great dispute that was going on in the church over this doctrine of Arianism, called the first ecumenical council, the first church-wide or worldwide council, the Council of Nicaea, and it was set up primarily to address this issue of Arianism. And at the council, we don't know exactly how this happened, but it turned out that the Arians ended up giving in, and the council, the Nicene Creed, which was exactly the opposite of Arianism, got adopted. But what we saw last week was that the Arians really weren't convinced, they were more cowed. And it could have been Constantine leading on people. It could have been that the Arians, overplayed their hand, but we don't know enough about how the council actually conducted its business to know what happened, but we do know that the Arians kept coming back for more bites at the apple after the council was over. And what we saw last week was that the champion of the Nicene Creed was this guy named Athanasius, okay? He was made Bishop of Alexandria, where Arianism had started, and Athanasius's personality was basically, he was brilliant, but he was an authoritarian, right? And he tried to rule the Alexandrian church with kind of an iron fist and made a lot of enemies, both in Alexandria and worldwide, because he kept beating the Arians who were trying to kind of insinuate themselves back into church theology. So the Arians had undergone a number of machinations to try to bring down Athanasius, who they viewed as the chief stumbling block in their mission of getting Arianism back into the mix, back into the discussion for church doctrine. And as we saw, where we left off last week was that they had succeeded in deposing Athanasius, and Constantine had exiled Athanasius. And we left Athanasius in exile up in France, okay? So where we pick up tonight is the death of Constantine the Great in the year 337. So at that point, Athanasius is in exile. And what happens on Constantine's death, he had actually planned for his brothers to take over a role in governing the empire as sort of co-emperors. His sons were very young at that time, and he wanted his brothers to have a role. But what ended up happening was there was a bloodbath, a purge, and the troops didn't want anybody but the sons of Constantine to rule them. And Constantine's sons, at least his one son Constantius, seems to have played a role in facilitating that. So all of Constantine's brothers are killed. Several other members of his family are killed. And in fact, only a couple of his nephews are left alive. And one of them is going to be prominent in our story tonight, Julian. So the empire gets divided among Constantine's three sons. We've got Constantine II, who's the oldest, Constantius, who is the second oldest, and Constans, who's still actually a teenager at this point, okay? But they end up kind of dividing up the empire into thirds. Constantius, it's the eastern part of the empire, and then Constantine and Constans get the western part, with Constans kind of being under the tutelage of his older brother. So we've kind of got an east and west, but the west is more or less divided in half, okay? The Western emperors are devoutly Nicene in their attitude, whereas Constantius is sympathetic to Arianism. And of course, he becomes emperor in just that part of the empire where the Arians are strongest. So what the brothers do is they proclaim a general amnesty for all exiled bishops. Okay, it's not just Athanasius who's in exile, but there are other bishops in exile for a variety of reasons. So they say, we're going to do an amnesty. We're going to let all these bishops come back into the fold. So Athanasius is restored to his office of bishop in Alexandria, Egypt. Okay. Now, Constantius, who is the emperor in that part of the world, right, and who is an Arian kind of in his proclivities, he views Athanasius as a troublemaker. Okay. But nevertheless, the two make their peace. They meet and they kind of come to a modus vivendi, if you will, a mode of living together. And Athanasius returns in triumph to Alexandria. He's got his faction there where he's very popular, so he's welcomed with open arms by that group. But of course, there are other groups there who are not going to welcome him, right? The Arians, that are still in Alexandria, the Meletians, the hardliners, right, who want to take a hard line against the Traditores, okay? And they know that Athanasius is going to put his thumb down on them the way he did before. So what the Arians do is that they nominate their own bishop of Alexandria. So they're trying to split the church. And if you'll remember, there had already been a Meletian bishop. The Meletians had already, before Athanasius was restored, the Meletians had made their own bishop. So now we have in one city 3 bishops, okay, which is not how it's supposed to work in the church at this time. The bishop is the ruler, the sole ruler of any particular city's Christian church. So to top things off, to add more confusion and more chaos, remember that Athanasius's arch enemy is that bishop named Eusebius. Eusebius was the guy who was juiced in with the imperial family. He was really close to Constantine's sister, Constantia. And he had actually fostered Arius early in the dispute and had been exiled himself after the Council of Nicaea, but was able to worm his way back into power through his relationship with Constantine's sister. So Eusebius is now back in power, right? And he's got a sympathetic emperor in his part of the world, Constantius. So what he does is he and his fellow travelers in Arianism nominate a 4th bishop for the city of Alexandria, somebody that they feel will be beholden to them, a guy named Gregory. And the emperor, Constantius, goes along with this. So this Gregory, who is the newly appointed bishop in Alexandria, gets imperial troops to help him wrest control away from Athanasius of all the churches in Alexandria. And it turns into kind of a bloodbath. We've got troops going into churches where followers of Athanasius are holed up trying to keep, anybody from Gregory's party from getting in there, troops coming in and arresting people. And even on Good Friday, the troops end up flogging 34 people and imprisoning them, okay? On, one of the most holy days in the Christian calendar, we've got violence going on, okay? More resistors are imprisoned on Easter, okay? So it's descending even one step further. And in this struggle, a church actually ends up getting burnt down, okay? So this is how Gregory is taking control of the Alexandrian church through brute force, okay? And Athanasius is forced to flee. He can't stand up to the imperial troops that are backing up Gregory. So now Gregory is in place as the bishop in Alexandria, and Athanasius flees to Rome. So here he appeals to one of the other major bishops in the Christian church, the Bishop of Rome, whom we now call the Pope, okay? Now, at this time, the Pope was not yet recognized as, the monarchical leader of the Catholic Church. Rather, the Bishop of Rome was one of about 4 really prominent bishops worldwide. You had the Bishop of Alexandria, huge city, ancient church, founded by, St. Mark. Antioch was another ancient church, right? That's mentioned in Acts. Rome, of course, it's the capital. It's where Peter and Paul were believed to have been martyred. So you've got these major churches where those bishops, for a variety of reasons, have more clout than most of the other bishops, okay? And the Bishop of Rome is already at this point trying to make the case that that bishopric should be supreme over the entire church, okay? But it's far from being recognized that way, as we're going to see. So what the Pope does in response to Athanasius's pleas is he calls a council and he summons some of the Eastern bishops who have been persecuting Athanasius, okay? And normally when a council is called, it's called by the metropolitan bishop, kind of the most important bishop in that province, and he just summons the local suffragan bishops. So normally the Pope would call a council and summon just the bishops from Rome, okay? If Athanasius were to call a council in Alexandria, he would summon the Egyptian bishops. It's not usual for a bishop to call in other bishops from outside other parts of the empire, right? The Ecumenical Council of Nicaea was unique, and it was Constantine who had called that, right? So it wasn't one bishop trying to pretend like he was the most powerful of bishops. It was the emperor, okay? So this is unique in what the Pope is trying to do, and the Easterners take umbrage at this, right? They say, who are you to summon us to a council in Rome, okay? And more importantly, we already held a council in Tyre that deposed Athanasius. You don't have any authority to overturn or second guess the results of that council that we've held. So they call BS on the Pope, basically, okay? So the Pope goes ahead with his council, and it's comprised solely of Westerners and a few sympathetic Easterners who have shown up, and it finds in favor of Athanasius. And basically the Pope says, I'm going to overturn the results of the Council of Tyre where you had deposed Athanasius. And by doing this, by saying that if you disagree with the findings of a local council, okay, you can appeal to me, the Bishop of Rome. The Pope is basically asserting a new power, okay? And he's doing this on his own. It's not like the rest of the church is going along with this, far from it, right? The Eastern bishops are saying, no, you don't have the authority to second guess us. So now we've got a more muddled situation. The Pope has tried to undo what the Council of Tyre has ordered. The Eastern bishops are still saying, we're going by what the Council of Tyre said. Athanasius, of course, is saying, I'm going along with what the Council of Rome had ordered, okay? And there's not worldwide agreement. So the emperors decide we've got to get this back on track. We got to sort this out. So they end up calling a new council, okay? A new ecumenical council that hopefully will be able to be the final word on the Arians and Athanasius and all these questions. So by this time, we're down to two emperors, Constantine II and Constans, the two guys who were dividing up the West. They had had their falling out, and Constans had emerged victorious. So we've got Constans in the West and Constantius in the East. Constans is a Nicene in his proclivities. Constantius in the East is an Arian. And these two guys say, let's order a council, and we will order it to be held kind of right on the border between East and West, at a city that was then called Serdica, but is now Sofia, Bulgaria, okay? So city still exists, different name, okay? So the emperors order bishops from both East and West to attend, And so 80 Eastern bishops comply, but they do so sullenly. And when they get there, they refuse to share a hall with Athanasius, who they don't view as a legitimate bishop. He has been deposed by a church council. So they won't even enter the same room where Athanasius is. And so it devolves into a fiasco, okay? The emperors have called this one council to sort everything out. And what happens instead is that it breaks up into two separate councils. The Westerners have their little council, and the Easterners meet separately from them, and they have their separate council. And what happens is they basically excommunicate each other, okay? The Western council deposes all the Easterners for failing to show up to the council that had been ordered, and the Western council affirms the Pope's appellate power. So we've got one step forward in the power of the papacy through what the Western bishops are doing. The Eastern council deposes the Pope, okay? So as if this isn't bad enough that the council itself has broken up, the Easterners then retreat physically to a different city altogether, the nearby city of Adrianople. And that bishop, the Bishop of Adrianople, has heard what's going on, and he's a Nicene Christian in his sympathies. So he refuses to have communion with them. He won't meet with them, just as they wouldn't participate in the council. So they have him imprisoned. And then there are some hecklers among the crowd, Nicene Christians who are, jeering these Eastern bishops, and the Eastern bishops arrange with the troops to execute some of these guys. So it's becoming a bloodbath over this question of doctrine, okay? Yep.
This was his own town, and they imprisoned him in his own town?
Yes, and remember that, they would have had the backing of the Eastern emperor, right? And so they're going to have the troops on their side, regardless of what the bishop might have to say about it. So what we see here with this Council of Serdica is kind of a clarifying of a major trend that we're going to see from this point forward, right? It's the division between Western Christianity and Eastern Christianity, okay? And even today, right, the West, we have Roman Catholicism, okay, who looks to the Pope, but in the East, they have Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and they don't recognize the Pope, right? And they have a number of other differences of practice from the Catholics. For example, their priests can be married, okay? And this is where we're starting to see that division become clear. We've already kind of seen it happening with these Eastern bishops kind of gravitating toward Arianism, where the Western bishops, have been Nicene in their sympathies. But this is kind of a clarifying point that we've really got a East-West division in Christianity.
And when is this?
342. So the story with the dirty tricks between the Arians and the Nicenes has one more sordid chapter, okay? So what we have is two Western bishops visiting the eastern city of Antioch. Antioch is in Syria, okay, north of Jerusalem. So two Western bishops go there. They're also in attendance within their party is a general from the Western Empire, okay? So it's a big deal, right? We would expect the local bishop to, extend them all hospitality and courtesy. But instead, what he tries to do is discredit them, these Nicene Christians, by sneaking a prostitute into one of the Western bishops' bedroom. right? And so, she's supposed to cry out in the middle of the night, and then it's going to look like he's hired a prostitute, and oh, look at how dirty these Nicene Christians are, right? They sleep with prostitutes. Well, the general realizes right away, what this clumsy trick has been about, and he exposes it, right? And it backfires on the Arian Christian bishop of Antioch, okay? And in fact, that bishop ends up getting deposed. But what this has done is it has now given Constans, the emperor in the West, kind of a casus belli, a reason for going to war against his brother Constantius in the East. So if he wants to, this could be, his excuse for making war on his brother and becoming sole emperor. So as a result of this, Constantius realizes he's got to make nice with Athanasius and the Nicenes, right? And as it happens, Bishop Gregory dies, and Constantius is able to put Athanasius back on his cathedral chair there in Alexandria. He needs to blunt Constans' momentum, right? He needs to take away this rationale for war, right? And to top things off, to show that there are absolutely no hard feelings and we're not going to go back to hating you again, Athanasius, he orders all the records from Athanasius's trial there at the Council of Tyre to be destroyed, okay? There's no memory, no institutional memory that we ever did anything bad or that Athanasius was ever deposed. Constans ends up getting overthrown by his own troops, leaving Constantius with a free hand again. So now Constantius can go back and persecute Athanasius again. And he doesn't waste any time, okay? He sends imperial troops to storm Athanasius's cathedral and arrest him. But in the confusion, in all the hubbub, some of Athanasius's supporters are able to spirit him out of the cathedral. And Athanasius, who has been this lightning rod for the whole dispute, and at the same time, the most stalwart defender of the Nicene Creed, he spends the last years of his life in hiding, on the lam, as we would say, okay? And basically from hiding, he writes scathing tracts against the Arians and against the Emperor Constantius. But he will not be emperor or bishop of Alexandria again. Lest ye think that we have seen the end of Arianism, though, think again. And it's particularly going to be important in my next class on the fall of the Roman Empire. There's this guy named Ulfilas, okay? And Ulfilas, as a child, is held captive among this barbarian tribe who occupies the lands north of the Roman Empire, the Goths, okay? And this picture is kids today who dress in black, they call themselves Goths, okay? So yes, if you see kids like that, they call themselves Goths, all right? So the Goths in our story were a Germanic barbarian tribe that was just outside the borders of the Roman Empire. Well, Ulfilas was a Roman citizen who, as a child, was a captive among the Goths. So he knows how to speak Gothic. He understands their culture, their belief systems, and so forth. And at age 30, we find Ulfilas in Constantinople. Possibly the Goths have traded him back as a hostage, or perhaps even sent him as an ambassador to the Roman Empire. Okay, for whatever reason, he's there, and he crosses paths with Eusebius. Eusebius being the bishop who has been stirring everything up and promoting the Arian cause. So Eusebius ordains this guy named Ulfilas a bishop and says, go become a missionary to the Goths, convert them to Christianity. And of course, the kind of Christianity that he teaches his new bishop is Arian Christianity. So the Goths are going to be converted to Christianity, but they're going to be converted as Arians rather than Nicene Christians. And what we're going to learn about in the next class, if you choose to attend, is that the Goths will end up conquering much of the Roman Empire. And that is going, their Arian faith is going to have huge implications for their ability to hold on to power and how they treat the areas that they control. So any questions about the battle for the Nicene Creed before I move into the next phase of our class? We're kind of shifting gears here. Any questions out in Zoom land about Arianism or the Nicene Creed? Okay, so let's turn the clock back a little bit. Constantine had died in 337 AD. And just to kind of remind ourselves where Christianity stood at that point, it was a favored religion for Constantine, but it was not the sole nor even the official religion of the Roman Empire. In fact, Christianity was probably still a minority religion at that point. A strong minority, certainly stronger than when Constantine came to power, but Constantine did not effect the conversion of the great mass of the Roman Empire, okay? So he died, his empire is divided among his three sons, and remember that there was that bloodbath where Constantine's brothers and several other family members got murdered. And only two of them, two children, were spared in this bloodbath. Two young nephews named Gallus and Julian, okay? And Julian in particular is going to be the focus of much of the rest of tonight's class. So what Constantius does with those two little boys, he's killed their parents, he's killed pretty much all their relatives except himself and his brothers. So he confines them to a remote place. He tucks them away in this castle in the mountains of Asia Minor, of Turkey, okay? And by 350, as we saw, Constantius himself has emerged as the sole emperor of the whole Roman Empire, okay? So these boys, by that point, are probably 20-ish years old. They were little children at the time of Constantine's death, and now they're young adults, okay? So what is Constantius like? Well, he's a very conscientious emperor, right? He works really hard. He spends a lot of hours at his desk, making sure the business of the empire is getting run. But in a personal sense, he's a very paranoid individual, okay? And he styles himself emperor of the universe. So he has an exalted view of his own role in the world. And extremely aloof, untouchable. Nobody is really Constantius's friend. He doesn't trust anybody. He doesn't want to be close to anybody. So that's what his personality is like. In terms of his religious policy, right? He's a busybody, okay? He's very active in trying to control church affairs. And he holds a number of councils, right? And oftentimes the issue is Arianism, and he's kind of gently or not so gently pushing the Arian view. In fact, he styles himself Bishop of Bishops, okay? So we've got the emperor basically saying, I am the head of the church, okay? And what he does when he has these councils is if the council isn't going his way, right, then he kind of steps in personally and intimidates or openly threatens the participants of the council. And bishops who try to stand up to him, he actually exiles them. And one of the bishops that he ends up exiling is the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, who's tried to stand up to him. So he's not messing around with defiant Christian bishops. He implements an anti-pagan policy. He bans sacrifices. Remember, Constantine had taken some steps against the pagans. Constantius takes things, a step further, bans sacrifices altogether. Constantine had banned personal sacrifices. Now they're banned altogether. He closes many of the pagan temples. He outlaws soothsayers and magicians, right? And in a very provocative step, he removes a important pagan symbol from the Senate house. It's called the altar of victory, okay? And this has been there since the time of Augustus. So over 300 years, almost 400 years at this point, the altar of victory has been in the Senate house. It was originally a statue of the goddess Victory that the Romans had captured in one of their many wars, right? So it was a war trophy that they then turned into kind of this altar. And it was kind of the religious focus of the Senate house. For example, whenever a new senator was sworn in, he was sworn in on the altar of victory. And on New Year's Day, all of the senators would go there and they would burn incense on the altar of victory as in honor of the pagan gods. So it was a very powerful symbol of paganism within the Roman state. And Constantius removes it from the Senate house, which brings cries of lamentation from those pagans still in the Senate. Nevertheless, despite all these steps, paganism continues to exist or persist in the Roman Empire. There's still a pagan priesthood. There are still other pagan rituals that remain untouched. Constantius himself still takes the title of Pontifex Maximus. So he's not willing to relinquish that important title. And the aristocracy is probably still largely pagan at this point. Not sure if it's 50-50 or leaning one way or the other, but we know there were a lot of conservative aristocrats who remained pagans. And many areas of the Roman Empire remained almost entirely pagan in their sympathy. And those areas sometimes just openly flouted the emperor's laws. They continued to allow sacrifices. In particular, the countryside, right? Outside the cities, those areas remained largely pagan. In fact, our word pagan comes from the Latin word pagani, which literally means country dweller, okay? So in this era, if you were a country dweller, that was effectively saying you were a pagan, okay? The other pagan entity that remains is an institution called the Vestal Virgins, which is a very fascinating piece of Roman society. The Vestal Virgins were priestesses of a pagan goddess named Vesta. She was the goddess of the hearth, okay? And the hearth is, of course, the center of any person's home. It's the center of warmth. It's where you do your cooking, right? That's the core of anybody's home. So Vesta, as the goddess of the hearth, is a beloved kind of core goddess in the Roman pagan pantheon. And what the Vestal Virgins were required to do was to tend Rome's sacred flame, a fire that was supposed to embody the city's spirit. And if they ever let this flame go out, there was severe punishment. They would be beaten bloody by the citizens. And on New Year's Day, the citizens would come to the temple of Vesta, and they would stick a wick inside this flame that the Vestal virgins were tending and take it home to light their hearth. So it was a way of tying the city together, right, for the year, and they would renew this practice every year. So who were the Vestal virgins? There were 6 of them, and they were members of good standing, of families of good standing in Rome, and they would commit themselves to 30 years of chastity, okay, in service to the city of Rome. And their punishment, if they were found to have broken their vow of chastity, if they had fornicated with somebody, was that they would be buried alive, okay? So a horrible, horrible punishment. And the guy that they had fornicated with would be beaten to death in the public square, right? The Vestals could walk around Rome, and if they were walking through the city of Rome, everybody would have to clear a path. And if you didn't get out of their way, that was an executable offense. You could be killed for that, right? But by the same token, if they happened to pass by a condemned criminal on his way to be executed, they could touch that criminal and he would be pardoned from that point. So the Vestals were this beloved part of Roman society, and they continue even despite all of the things that Constantius is doing. And I explain this all to you to show that paganism was not easy to stamp out, right? It was not dying a quiet death. Even so, Christianity continues to advance under Constantius. Whole towns sometimes convert en masse to Christianity. And as we saw when we were talking about Constantine, there are both holy and secular motives for this, right? The Christian clergy from Constantine's time have special exemptions from taxation and from public burdens. And so some people find it in their financial interest to convert to Christianity, even though they don't truly believe. So that's one of the ways that we see the numbers of Christians increasing. So now we get to paganism's counteroffensive in the person of Julian, whom history has nicknamed the apostate, right? The guy who undoes Christianity or goes back on his beliefs. So Julian was one of those 2 little kids that was spared during the bloodbath at Constantine's death, when his brothers and most of his family members were killed by Constantine's sons, okay? But they spared Julian and his brother Gallus because they were just little kids. Remember, they had been sent to live in this remote castle in Turkey where they couldn't cause anybody trouble. And what happens there is that they're given a good education, a good Christian education, in fact, by a local bishop, but also a good classical education. So they're raised as if they're kind of princes in waiting, or spares that Constantius knows he may need to tap into this resource at some point, okay? So Julian is actually freed from his captivity at the age of about 18. He's set loose from this castle, and what Julian does is he goes to Athens. He has developed an intense interest in classical Greek philosophy. He wants to go study in Athens, the home of this thinking, this thought process, and study under the great philosophers who are still there in Athens at this time. So at the same time that he's very interested in Greek philosophy, it's possible, maybe even probable, that he has come to associate Christianity with his hated uncle, cousin, Constantius, who had killed his parents, right? So he might associate Christianity with the guy who has locked him up for most of his life and made him an orphan. Whatever reason, he is going to revert to paganism at the first opportunity. So what happens is that Constantius, as sole emperor, finds himself facing the same challenge that Diocletian had faced at the beginning of our class, right? The emperor can't be everywhere at once, right? And Constantius has got his hands full fighting the Persians over here. And there are barbarian incursions up in Gaul. So he needs a co-emperor on the scene, somebody he can trust up there to hold down that corner of the empire. And this is where he taps his two young nephews. First Gallus, and Gallus doesn't work out, gets himself killed. So then he promotes Julian. Julian is a young guy. He's been raised in, basically isolation. He has no military experience. He has no governmental experience, no administrative experience whatsoever. He's just a bearded philosopher and a kid on top of that. He's probably 21 years old at this point, okay? And so Constantius is kind of thinking to himself, well, two things can happen, right? Either the kid will fail and he'll be somebody I don't have to worry about anymore, or maybe he'll succeed up there and do a good job of keeping the barbarians at bay. I can't really lose, right? It's unlikely that he's going to raise himself to the point where he's really going to be able to challenge me. So what Julian does in this position is the first thing he says is, I got to learn how to be a soldier. I got to learn how this works so that the troops will respect me. And he finds a centurion, one of the basically non-commissioned officers of the Roman army, right? A career soldier. And he says, teach me how to be a soldier. And don't treat me like a member of the imperial family. Treat me like any of your raw recruits. I want to learn this from the ground up. And by doing this, he does learn how to be a soldier and he earns the army's respect. This kid has got moxie, okay? So once he's learned how to be a soldier, then he takes command of the armies up there and he does a good job against the barbarians. He ejects them from the empire, and then he actually leads his armies into barbarian territory and conducts some punitive expeditions against them, okay? And administratively, he takes a look around at himself, at what's going on, sees a lot of corruption, which he takes steps to eradicate, and he lowers taxes on the subjects. So Julian is making himself popular with the army and popular with the people, which you can imagine how our paranoid Emperor Constantius is going to react when he hears all these glowing reports about how great of a guy his nephew Julian is. So Constantius sends an order over and he says, Julian, tell all your legions to come east. They need to help me fight the Persians, right? And these guys do not want to leave Julian. They don't want to leave their home up there in France. So they basically declare Julian as an emperor, okay? As Augustus on the same level of Constantius. And so what we've got is a showdown, right? Julian versus Constantius, and the two armies are headed toward the clash when Constantius dies suddenly. And now Julian is the only emperor left. And basically what Julian does when he's got power is he looks around at the bloat in the imperial government and guts it, right? One great story that is told is that as emperor, he needs to get a haircut. So he calls for the official barber. And this guy comes in with several attendants and he's dressed from head to toe like he's some kind of an Asian king. And Julian looks at this guy and he's like, I asked for a barber. And he's like, yes, sir, I'm your barber. And Julian realizes just how much waste and bloat there is in the imperial government. And he fires the barber and he fires a bunch of cooks and all these various sundry offices that have accumulated over the years that are sucking all the resources out of the Roman Empire, okay? He turns back the clock. Remember, Diocletian had changed the very nature of the office of emperor, right? Augustus had set himself up as princeps, first citizen, right? He stood in the Senate house in his toga and spoke to the senators. Diocletian made the office of emperor like a god, right? He was sitting on that throne, removed from all of society, right? Well, Julian tries to undo what Diocletian has done. He operates again like a princeps from the Senate, like a regular senator, first among equal. And he restores a lot of power to the localities, powers that the central government had arrogated over the years. So he is making a big splash. Yeah.
When Constantius was killed, is there any?
Not that I know of. No, I think he died of natural causes. So good question, though. So what does Julian believe, right? Well, he has a pretty sophisticated view of paganism. He believes in it as in an unknowable supreme being, right? Who emanated a creator power, right? The Helios or the sun. So there was this unknowable supreme being there that we can't see, who created the sun, and the sun created everything that we can see, right? And these national deities, like Jehovah for the Jews, or like Zeus for the Greeks, they're all just each community's perception of this same unknowable God. They're not different gods, they're the same God, they're just different names for this all-powerful entity, okay? And he points out that all these different creation myths that the different religions have are all just allegories of the same great drama of creation that he has conceived. So he believes in a single God manifesting himself in different ways to different peoples, okay? But he's got to undo Christianity, which again has been gaining steam in the empire. And his strategy for undermining Christianity is counterintuitive, right? He's been watching what has been going on with this fiasco over the Nicene Creed, and he says, I don't have to do what Diocletian did and persecute the Christians, right? That didn't work. I'm going to let the Christians do whatever they want. I'm going to give them complete freedom, and they're going to consume themselves. A historian of this time period, a guy named Ammianus Marcellinus, writes in his history of the reign of Julian, Julian understood that no wild beasts are such enemies to mankind as most Christians in their deadly hatred of one another. Okay? So, he revokes the clergy's special privileges. Okay, so you're not going to get any special exemptions from the rules of society by being a Christian priest anymore. But he does do some things that very subtly eat away at the power of the Christian clergy. He bans Christian teachers from using the pagan classics. And this is really huge because in this age, right, everybody's education is built on the classics, in particular Homer, right? The epic poems written by Homer, right? The fall of Troy and the journeys of Odysseus, right? Every educated person has read those things and basically knows them by heart. It's the equivalent of the Bible in a lot of ways, in that you make allusions to these classic works in your daily life to show that you're an educated person. So when he says, yeah, you can teach Christianity, but since you don't believe all this pagan mumbo jumbo, you can't use our books, okay? You can only teach out of the Bible, for example, right? And that is going to, in that day, it's going to make Christian teachers less valuable, okay? It's going to be as if you sent your kid to a school that only taught out of the Bible today and didn't teach math or science or anything else that a person needs to get along in the world. That's basically what Julian is doing here. And he actually writes his own treatise debunking Christianity. It's called Against the Galileans. He calls the Christians the Galileans. He won't even use the common term that the Christians have adopted for themselves. And what happens is that, yes, the Christians do start kind of eating their own, right? We have a rival bishop of Alexandria who ends up getting lynched by his Christian opponents. And Julian makes sure the authorities don't step in. Let the Christians fight it out amongst themselves. That's what I want. And we occasionally see pagan attacks on Christians. They feel emboldened to take their vengeance against the Christians who have been gaining more and more power and influence during their life. Where he fails is when he tries to reorganize the pagan religion, and he tries to basically set up a pagan priesthood modeled on the hierarchy of the Christian church with bishops and priests and deacons and so forth. And he wants these pagan priests to act as moral exemplars in the way that Christian clergy mainly do, okay? And he advocates a pagan version of charity similar to what the Christians have been practicing, okay? And this is where it's really telling what he says about the Christians. He says, these impious Galileans feed not only their own poor, but ours also. In other words, Christians are giving food to the pagan children that are starving, okay? How dare they, right? They attract them as children are attracted with cakes. So he's basically saying, we've got to do what the Christians are doing and be more charitable, because that's one of their nefarious tactics for gaining converts. Well, it's a hopeless quest. There's no ethical tradition or basis to paganism like there is to Christianity, okay? And the pagan priests are not interested in living the austere lifestyle that a Christian priest has to live. So they're like, you want me to do what? So it all kind of comes to a head in the city of Antioch, where he is trying to restore a dilapidated pagan shrine there, the temple of the goddess Daphne, okay? And he really goes overboard, right? Spends a ton of money, even to the point that the local pagans are like, man, this is just excessive, okay? And the people there in Antioch, in addition to viewing it as excessive, they see him as kind of a strange individual. They're not into their pagan cults the way that he appears to be. And they view him as this kind of bearded, ascetic philosopher. He doesn't seem like one of them. He seems weird, okay? And so Julian gets really frustrated with the citizens of Antioch, and he actually writes a play satirizing them called Beard Hater. So he's far from gaining the support of the pagan population. He's now kind of set himself at odds with them. So it's doomed to fail. And one thing that he tries to do to undermine Christianity, he attempts to rebuild the Jewish temple. And what happens is there's an earthquake while that's happening, and like a fireball comes out while they're trying to rebuild the temple, and everybody views it as like this divine act saying what you're doing is impious. And so it literally backfires on him, okay? Julian despite all the stuff that he's done, and it seems like he's been emperor for years and years and years, is actually only emperor for 2 years before he dies fighting in Persia, where he wanted to emulate Alexander the Great. He wanted to take the borders of the Roman Empire all the way to India. So we will talk about the heirs of Julian next week in our final installment, and when the church stands up to these meddling Christian emperors trying to impose their will. So thanks for sticking around a minute or two past our closing time. Any questions from here in the room or out in Zoom land on what we talked about tonight? All right, well, have a great week, and we will see you next Monday at 6 p.m.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
Hey, thanks a lot. Really appreciate
Not
it.
6 a.m., no.
Thanks. That was great.
Thank you, appreciate that.
That was fitting. Think me, but this guy in power a lot more.
Yeah.
Because I get it.